The obvious shift is that many people are working remotely. I have been really surprised by how many of the companies that we're investing in or considering investing in are remote first from the beginning. Somebody will ask us, oh, where's this company based? It's like, I don't know, like in the internet, like they have people all over. There's not even this question of where should we start our company. It's just going to be online. It's going to be remote by default.
Welcome to Freedom Matters, where we explore the intersection of technology, productivity, and digital well-being. I'm your host, Georgie Powell, and each episode we'll be talking to experts in productivity and digital wellness. We'll be sharing their personal stories and experience on how to take back control of technology. We hope you leave feeling inspired, so let's get to it. This week, I'm in conversation with John Zeratsky. John is the co-founder and general partner at Character, where he supports technology startups with capital and sprints. He's the best-selling author of Sprint and Make Time, and a former design partner at Google Ventures. This week, we'll be talking about the power of sprints, of reflection, and of asynchronous work done well. John, thank you so much for joining us on Freedom Matters. We are really grateful to have you here today on this episode.
Thank you so much.
To kick off, I wanted to ask John to introduce his book, Make Time, and the 4 key principles which underpin it.
Sure. So Make Time is a book which is based on a framework that I created with my good friend and collaborator, Jake Knapp. And it's really meant as a toolkit for people who want to spend more of their time on the things that they care about and less time on all the other stuff, stuff that gets in the way, the stuff that distracts us, the stuff that we find ourselves mindlessly turning toward. And it turns out that everybody, wishes they could spend more time on the stuff that really matters. It really comes from the work that we did previously working with startup teams when Jake and I were at Google Ventures. And we would go into a team after we had made an investment, and we wanted to help them make sure that they were focused on the right stuff. They weren't wasting precious time having too many meetings and sending too many emails, but really bringing their teams together. They were small teams, bringing them together and helping them just tackle the most important work that they had to do. And one of the reasons we were able to do that is we created this process called a design sprint. And what it did was it helped a team sort of reset their defaults. So if you go into the office, you have a day full of work, you have certain things you do, certain meetings that happen at certain times, a certain cadence. That's your sort of default approach to work. And it's not necessarily optimized. I should say it's never optimized for spending time on the most important things. It's just a collection of habits and behaviors that stuck. Yeah. And so by having this deliberate outside push to put in some new defaults and do this design sprint thing and do this together for a week and make it a big event, we could really shift people's defaults. We could help them see a different way of working. And that was great. Those worked really, really well. Our first book, Sprint, was about that. People love it. But as we were doing this work, Jake and I were like, well, this is cool, but what about all the other days? What about all the days that you're not in a sprint, you're not at work, it's the weekend or it's the evening or the morning or whatever. How can we bring the same kind of focus and intention to our whole lives? And so that became the impetus for Make Time. And so we kind of translated the lessons from Sprint and from design sprints, from working with teams. We translated that into this Make Time framework. And like you said, there's 4 components to it. We think of it really as 4 steps, this loop that you should go through every day. The first one is highlight. And it's all about identifying the one thing you want to make sure you make time for on any given day. Sometimes it's something productive that needs to get done, but other times it's just something that is going to bring a bit of joy. It's going to bring a bit of levity or relaxation to your day. But we think that if you can start each day by choosing a highlight, you're going to set yourself up for success. The next step is called laser, and it's all about changing those defaults around our technology so that we can retain greater control over what we're paying attention to. So modifying settings on our phone or uninstalling apps or using things like Freedom to be able to actually feel like we're in control and we're using those devices to support what we want to do rather than the other way around. So that's the second step. The third step is energize. And this one's a little bit different because it's not about our time or our priorities or our to-do list. It's just about taking care of ourselves, acknowledging that our brains and bodies work together. If we're low on energy because we didn't sleep well, we didn't eat well, we can't think straight. Acknowledging that and really trying to take care of our bodies on an everyday basis so that we can retain control over our focus, so that we can spend time on the things that matter. And then the fourth step might be the most important of all, and it's reflect. And we saw when we were working with teams in design sprints that we could not only help the teams do better work together, but we could make the process itself, sort of the approach that we brought to those teams, we could make that better with time if we treated each week like an experiment. And if we said, okay, what went well? What didn't go so well? And it's kind of crazy because we're used to doing these things at work, right? Like we're used to having retrospectives and postmortems and summarizing a project and talking about what went well or what didn't. But in our personal lives, we don't really do that. Maybe on a birthday or at the end of the year or a holiday, we might think, oh, what a year, what a month, whatever. We might lightly look back, but we tend to not look very deeply at what worked or what didn't work. And so reflect is all about trying to just look back on the day, the end of the day, or first thing in the morning the next day, and take a few notes on how things went, whether you were able to spend time on the things that were important to you. And then if not, what tweaks you want to make? What are the next set of little experiments that you want to do the following day so that you can hopefully make things a little bit better for yourselves?
So I love your quote on your website, and it says, "The purpose of life is to find contentment in the work of serving others. I am grateful for the privilege to make this my life's work." So this is obviously how you have come to understand and define your work and your sense of fulfillment. Having a sense that you love your work and you can find flow and connection with your work is understanding what your true purpose is. So how did you get to that place, and how can other people get to that place?
I'll explain how I got to that place, and I don't know if it's going to translate perfectly into how other people can get there. And in fact, I think one of the things that I've struggled with is moving a level up from the day-to-day. I feel that I have a lot to offer, a lot to bring to people in terms of how are you spending time today, this week? If you know what your priority is or what you care about, how do you translate that into action? That's a place that I've spent a lot of time working and thinking, and I feel good about. When people come to me and they say, I don't know what my priority should be, that's where I struggle a little bit, because the way that I came to it was essentially the product of a lot of time and a lot of work that was driven very much by intuition. For the first, 15 or so years of my career as a designer, that's kind of my trade, is I'm a software product designer. I was just jumping from project to project, working on interesting things, taking new jobs or promotions or, assignments, whatever. And then in 2017, I decided to step away from all that. I was a bit burned out. I wasn't feeling the same kind of enthusiasm. And my wife and I, we took a sabbatical. My wife was kind of similarly at a point in her career where she was also ready to step away for a bit. And we were very fortunate and privileged to be able to take a break. And we ended up spending about 18 months traveling on our sailboat. We traveled through Central America from the west coast of the United States to the east coast. And a funny thing happened. We were about halfway through that period, and we were both sort of like, we kind of miss working. What's the deal with that? Because we weren't working, I had a lot of time on my hands to think about that. And so I just started to think back over the projects and the kinds of work that really felt rewarding to me. And I realized that it was not the work where I directly had an impact on a thing. So it wasn't the work where I was designing an app or a website or something. It was the work where I was in a position to help other people be better at what they did. So I was a facilitator, I was a coach. So it just sort of crystallized. Obviously, few people are able to take 18 months off. It's an incredible luxury. But I think that some of those experiences can be replicated by creating space throughout normal life, in the days, in the weeks, in the months. And I think by having a more deliberate approach and intention to reflect and to look back. And that's one of the reasons why we put a reflection step into Make Time, is I think if you can have some external motivation to nudge you to say, hey, how did it go? How did you feel? What did you think about that? It enables you to have some of these insights and some of this clarity rather than sort of just waiting for it to happen organically, which was essentially what happened for me.
And you're right, though. It's just about being disciplined enough to make sure you give yourself that time and that space to think about what's next.
So I just want to push back a little bit because you used the word disciplined. And I think that this is perhaps we use different words for the same thing. But I encourage people to not rely on discipline, to not try to develop discipline. And I think that it's a misguided notion that we can develop and harness this mysterious, alluring thing called discipline, this willpower to make the right decisions in the moment. Intuitively, I think we all sense this, and there's actually a lot of research on behavior that shows that when we're faced with repeated actions, repeated decisions to quote unquote do the right thing, it's very, very difficult to maintain that discipline when you have habits or you have systems or you have environments that are pushing us in other directions. The path of least resistance always wins. And that's one of the reasons why I think freedom is so amazing and why we encourage people to reset the defaults on their devices, to uninstall apps, to actually change the environment of how they're operating, because then they don't have to rely on discipline. You don't have to make the decision when you're staring at your phone, okay, don't open Instagram right now. Don't do it. Don't open Instagram. Do the work you're supposed to do. You don't have to push yourself to say, okay, it's the end of the day. Don't forget to sit down and reflect. If instead your phone doesn't have Instagram or you've logged out of it on your computer, so you kind of don't really have the option to do it. And then you have a notebook that's sitting there, or you have a device that's saying, hey, how did it go today? That becomes the path of least resistance. I think it's ultimately much more sustainable because you're not relying on willpower or discipline to make those things happen. So sorry for the rant, but I think it's a really important philosophical component of all this stuff.
No, I very much appreciate it. We moved on to discuss the more practical applications of Make Time, how it's important to recognise how, regardless of privilege, we can all find some agency in the way that we structure our days and live our lives. Much of this requires an awareness of how we are really spending our energy and our time. And John explained more.
One of the tactics in Make Time that we honestly kind of added at the end, but has ended up being a big deal for people, is this activity called Stack Rank Your Life. And it's something that we use when we teach this. So in the course that I mentioned with the Dream Bank Academy, and also in our course, the Highlight course, it's really simple, but it's basically to make a list of all of the projects or areas of responsibility in your life. Everything from I maintain a social media account to I have to stay on top of my email to thinking we're moving house. So we're planning the move, or we just moved and so we're unpacking. It's like all these little things. So it's really just like writing them down. And then what we have people do is create 2 columns for scoring. So we ask people to score based on their sort of priority for those things. If you just think about it, okay, what's the most important thing on this list? That's a 1. Then the next most important thing is a 2, and so on. And then make a second column, which is how you actually spend your time, and look for the big deltas, look for the big differences. And this is can be sometimes rather painful, but of course it's intentionally difficult. But it's really interesting how often the things that are way out of whack are these things that aren't even really like on our radar as being projects. There's like thinking about making a move, or maybe a kid is sick, or maybe there's been some disruption to your commute or your routine. And you don't think of it as being a thing on your plate, but when you actually list it out and you look at it in the context of everything else, it helps people sometimes realize, oh, wow, that's actually like, that thing is not really that important, but it's completely draining my time and my energy away from all this other stuff that is important.
John is in and out of companies all the time, and now investing in many of them. I was interested to hear his perspective on how work is changing and what he considers to be some of the key trends for the future of work.
Yeah, the obvious shift is that many people are working remotely. I have been really surprised by how many of the companies that we're investing in or considering investing in are remote first from the beginning. So somebody will ask us, oh, where's this company based? It's like, I don't know, like in the internet, like they have people all over. There's kind of not even this question of where should we start our company. It's just going to be online. It's going to be remote by default. And so that I think is a very real trend. And there might be some reversion to people working together in person when the pandemic is over. But I don't think it's going to totally go back. I mean, I think there's been some real shifts forward that have happened. And then I think it's intersecting with a couple of other really interesting dimensions. One is how we separate time and space, or how we think about what do I do when I'm in this place? And even though commutes can be terrible, getting out of the house and going to work can be a pain, whatever, and there's a lot of nice advantages to working from home. One of the things that I think I certainly took for granted, and I think others did too, is that when you had a clean barrier between home life and work life, you could at least use that as a structure. So it just created this scaffolding to say, for example, I don't check my work email at home or something like that. But when you're working from home, there is no line between that. It just creates this new dimension that you have to think about. And then the other dimension that I find very fascinating is the difference between synchronous and asynchronous work. The default for most work has been in-person and synchronous, meaning that you go to a place with the other people you work with and you have lots of meetings. So you're working synchronously with them. And then when you're not in meetings, you're trading emails or Slack messages, which can be used asynchronously, but really both of those communication protocols encourage us to use them synchronously. But just as we're seeing a lot of new companies start remote first, we're also seeing a lot of companies start async first. And there's new sets of tools that really are designed as the operating system for async work. One that I've come across is called Almanac. It's really interesting. It's a place where a team can sort of document processes and decisions, and they can work asynchronously. They don't have to be in the meeting at the same time. They don't have to be shooting messages back and forth, but it really helps them work together, but in these separate threads. If sort of done right, it means that each person can choose to engage with the work that makes the most sense for them at that time. So maybe you're a morning person who wants to do deep focused work in the morning. Maybe you're a night owl and you want to save that for the end of the day. Maybe you want to, have a slightly later start because you like to have a morning with your family or getting the kids to school or whatever. I think the more that we can marry this sort of asynchronous trend with this remote trend, the bigger opportunities it creates for people to exercise a degree of control and attention over how they spend their time.
But working asynchronously requires strict boundary setting so that we don't just all work around the clock. How can we achieve this?
My wife and I, we moved in February into a house, which is where I'm sitting right now, but we previously lived in an apartment. It was pretty small. And so for most of the pandemic, we lived in this small apartment and we had a very large dining room table. And we called it our everything table because it was where we worked, where we ate, where we hung out, where we sat if we had friends over, people who were in our bubble, whatever. And there was this one funny thing that I would do, at least I think it's funny. I would work literally on the left side of the table. I had a monitor and keyboard and everything set up there. But then when it was lunchtime, I would go into the kitchen, I would make lunch, and I would sit 2 chairs over on the right side of the table.
Nice.
And so it's at the same table. I was in the same room. I was in the same house. But there was just this little break in my physical location and these different sets of routines and things tied to that little shift that helped me signify, okay, it's lunchtime. I don't work during lunch. I usually read during lunch. My wife and I are going to be sitting across the table from each other, eating lunch together. So little things like that, I think can actually go a long way toward helping us design structures and schedules that just, again, to use that word scaffolding, which I got from Annie Dillard, to help us create scaffolding that support us doing the things that are best for us at any given time of the day.
Musical chairs for adults. John, thank you so much for joining us today on the Freedom Matters podcast. You've been a fantastic guest. We love your work and we can't wait to see what comes next.
Thank you for having me, and thanks for all the work that you do. I'm a huge fan of freedom, and I think it's a really important tool for people who want to spend time on the stuff that matters.
Thank you for joining us on Freedom Matters. If you like what you hear, then subscribe on your favourite platform. And until next time, we wish you happy, healthy, and productive days.